I think people who track China should always be cautious about making predictions because predictions have so often been wrong. But this is one of the years that really reminds you of just how tough it can be to predict what's going to happen next week, let alone next month or next year. What's been happening on the streets right now with these intense anti-Japanese protests remind me intensely of what I saw in China in 1999 when there were anti-NATO protests after NATO bombs had hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And there were big protests. People were doing things on the streets that they wouldn't have been allowed to do if they were protesting something domestic, but they were allowed to do and even encouraged to do when it was against a foreign power. And so here we are again with a recurrence of something that reminds us of things that just haven't gone away in China. There's an idea of kind of competition and resentment of an era when Japan was the more powerful, had displaced China as the most powerful country in the region after a long period when China was obviously that. And I mean, I think you could even say that an awful lot of Chinese people have negative ideas about Japan and the Japanese. But I think there is a term in Chinese for Japanese devil. But a lot of people, when they use that, it doesn't mean that they don't have more ambivalent feelings in themselves, that when there isn't something like this going on, that they hate everything about Japan. Actually, a lot of young Chinese admire certain things about Japan, but then the patriotic education and then the territorial dispute, which, you know, it seems that China may be peculiarly obsessed about sovereignty over these islands, but it can also seem from some statements coming out of Japan that Japan is peculiarly obsessed with telling its own story about it. But I think there's a pragmatic side. There are resources that are connected with these small specks of land. But I think the bigger thing, most people would agree, is a kind of symbolic thing. That there was a time when, you know, China was, and this is a time that's remembered and that is not just remembered by people who actually remember it, but people are taught of this, that there was an era when China had control over much of Asia, and even places it didn't control looked to China as the great power of the area. And so the islands are really used, I think, as a proxy for the whole undermining of that idea of Chinese centrality that happened during the era of Japanese expansion. In these protests, like some of the earlier anti-Japanese protests and like those anti-NATO protests, there's a question of how much these are government manipulated or government sponsored. Different terms are used. In a way, it makes more sense, I think, to think of them as things the government is allowing to take place and trying to steer in particular directions, while also being kind of nervous that once people are on the streets, they might start complaining about other things. And there's been a little bit of that going on in these protests, just as there were in earlier times. So the government needs popular nationalism, but it's also nervous about popular nationalism. And there is genuine popular sentiment involved here. It's not as though people who shout down with Japan are not believing it or just saying things that they're being told. One thing that makes me nervous whenever these kinds of protests take place, in terms of American or Western images of China, is there's a real tendency in the commentary on them and op-eds and the like to fall back into the trap of thinking of China as much more homogeneous than it is. So you'll have people saying, oh, the Chinese really still hate Japan. Well, some Chinese have this kind of anger. Some are not going on the streets. Some are mocking people who go on the streets. We need to make room in our minds, even in moments like this, for Chinese people having wide diversity of opinion. They're not all on the same page.